They tell you that the Imperium of man was built on the foundation of 10,000 victories, consecrated by the blood of heroes. This is the first, the greatest, and the most necessary of all lies. The Imperium was not forged in the glorious fire of conquest. It was built in the cold, silent calculus of suffering, an equation written in a currency of expended souls so vast it defies comprehension. For every single hero immortalized in obsidian and gold, 1 billion lives are rendered down to statistical dust, their undocumented agonies the mortar that binds the crumbling galaxy together. Before we unseal the following record, a reminder: what you are about to witness has been deliberately forgotten. By subscribing, you ensure it is remembered. Have you ever truly considered the cost? Not the celebrated cost of war, but the silent, unceasing cost of survival. The price, paid every second of every day, for one more flickering moment of light from the Golden Throne. It is a price paid not by soldiers, but by fuel, and that fuel is human. You have seen the grand propaganda hololiths, the towering godlike titans, the angelic, weeping Primarchs, the endless roaring choruses of "For the Emperor." It is a masterfully orchestrated opera, a symphony of faith and fury designed to drown out the whispers of the terrible truth. But you and I, we have looked into the abyss of this galaxy long enough to know better. We know the truth is not found in the blinding muzzle flash of a bolter. It is found in the suffocating silence between screams, in the forgotten shipping manifests of the black ships, in the tear-stained, half-mad diaries of the damned. That is the truth we are here to unseal. In this chronicle, we will not follow a hero. We will bear witness to the final, inexorable journey towards the Golden Throne, not through one pair of eyes, but through 3 forgotten perspectives, their fates intertwined in this sacred, horrifying process. The Tithe, a young soul from a feral world, whose gift became her curse. The Ferryman, a veteran armsman of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, who has transported 1,000 such souls to their doom and has forgotten the meaning of mercy. And the Caretaker, a low-ranking tech priest, whose faith is measured in voltage and whose sacred duty is to wire the living fuel into the Emperor's salvation engine. Their stories converge to paint a singular, unflinching portrait of sacrifice, and you must stay until the very end. Because we have acquired a fragment of a picked log, classified for a millennium by the Inquisition's Ordo Hereticus, that records the final, silent microsecond of a soul's dissolution, a truth so fundamental and so terrible, it was ordered to be erased from all Imperial memory. Our story begins not on Terra, nor in the star-dusted void, but 10,000 light-years away on a forgotten feral world designated Oakhaven. A world of towering, petrified forests whose ancient canopies interlocked to create a ceiling of stone, filtering the light of its distant, dying sun into a perpetual purple twilight. Here, time was not measured in cycles or rotations, but by the slow, inexorable growth of phosphorescent moss on the forest floor and the shifting of ancient, stone-like roots. The people of Oakhaven lived in the hollowed-out trunks of these gargantuan trees, a tribal society bound by superstition, ritual, and a deep, instinctual fear of the dark spaces between the trees. They were a simple people, their lives governed by the hunt, the gathering, and the telling of stories. Elara was a child of this twilight. Before the change, her world was small and safe. It was the smell of wood smoke from the communal fire, the taste of roasted garroot, the feel of her younger brother Kyle's small hand in hers. She was nimble and quiet, with eyes that seemed to hold the purple dusk of her world within them. She knew the secret paths through the mossy roots, the places where the sweetest glowberries grew, and the calls of the nocturnal creatures that hunted in the shadows. She belonged. She was one with the rhythm of her people and her world. The change came without warning, not as a thunderclap, but as a silent, jarring note in the symphony of her existence. She and Kale were playing near the edge of the clearing, chasing the small, 6-legged scuttlers that darted between the roots. Kale, younger and bolder, scrambled up the base of a petrified branch the size of a hab block, a fossilized limb that had jutted out from its colossal parent trunk millennia ago. Elara watched from below, laughing when the feeling came. It was not a thought, nor a sound. It was a sudden, sickening lurch in the pit of her stomach, a spike of pure wrongness that screamed at her. The air grew thick. The light seemed to dim, and for a fraction of a second, she saw not with her eyes, but with her mind. A spider web of cracks racing through the stone above Kale, a silent, internal shattering. The vision lasted no longer than a heartbeat, but the certainty it left behind was absolute. Kale. Her scream was sharp, primal. Without thinking, she launched herself forward, tackling her brother at the knees just as an ear-splitting crack echoed through the forest. They tumbled to the ground in a tangle of limbs as 1,000,000 tons of petrified wood rained down on the spot where he had just been standing, the impact shaking the very ground beneath them, kicking up a cloud of ancient dust that momentarily blotted out the twilight. Silence followed. A profound, ringing silence. Kale, coughing and confused, looked from the mountain of rubble back to his sister, his eyes wide with a dawning, fearful awe. At first, the tribe called it a miracle. The elder, his face a mask of wrinkled bark, declared her touched by the silent sky spirits. She was a blessing, a portent. For a time, Elara was revered. Other children would follow her, asking her to see where the best hunting grounds were, or if the rains would come. But her gift was not a tool to be wielded. It was erratic, involuntary. Sometimes she would see flashes behind another's eyes, a moment of joy, a flicker of deep-seated anger. A touch could overwhelm her with emotions that were not her own. The reverence of the tribe slowly curdled into suspicion, then fear. A blessing that cannot be controlled is indistinguishable from a curse. The other children stopped playing with her. Mothers would pull their toddlers close when she walked by. The whispers started. Which child? Empty-eyed. Unnatural. The sense of belonging she had known her entire life began to fray, leaving her isolated in a world she no longer understood, haunted by a sense she could not control. She was no longer a child of Oakhaven. She was something other. The sky spirits came in a vessel of stained grey metal that descended from the perpetual clouds on a pillar of angry blue fire. It settled in the main clearing with a ground-shaking roar, crushing ancient petrified trees as if they were twigs. The people of Elara's tribe cowered in their hollowed-out homes, peering through cracks in the stonewood at the impossible sight. From the belly of the metal beast emerged figures that were not quite men. They were clad in stiff, dark armor and carried rods that spat beams of angry red light. They spoke a harsh, guttural tongue that grated on the ears, a language of commands and threats. They called themselves the agents of the Adeptus Administratum, and they had come for the tithe. For weeks, the village was turned upside down. The grey-clad men counted every soul, tested the strength of the young men, and catalogued the tribe's meager resources. They were cold, efficient, and utterly devoid of empathy. They saw the people of Oakhaven not as a culture to be understood, but as a resource to be harvested for the endless wars of their distant, unseen emperor. Elara, now an outcast, watched from the shadows, a knot of cold dread tightening in her stomach. Her gift, which had been quiet for some time, was now screaming. The minds of these off-worlders were a chaotic storm of emotions she could barely comprehend: impatience, contempt, a deep-seated weariness, and a casual cruelty that chilled her to the bone. The discovery happened during the final muster. The young men of the tribe were being herded towards the grey ship, destined for the Imperial Guard. A mother, weeping, broke from the crowd, clinging to her son. One of the grey-clad men raised his lasgun, the weapon's power cell whining as it charged. He did not intend to fire, merely to intimidate. But Elara saw it. A flash of a possible future, the gun discharging, the woman falling, a riot erupting. The vision was so powerful, so real, that she cried out. The lasgun in the man's hands suddenly bucked as if struck by an unseen force, its barrel twisting downwards. The shot discharged harmlessly into the ground, blasting a smoking crater in the packed earth. Every eye turned to her. The villagers, in terror. The grey-clad men. their faces hardening, their contempt instantly replaced by a cold, predatory focus. The lead agent raised a voxcaster to his lips. He spoke a single clipped word that Ilara did not understand, but felt the weight of it in her soul. Psyker. Aboard the black ship Silent Vigil, holding a high, silent orbit over Oakhaven, Armsman Kalin was polishing the power casing of his shock maul. It was a ritual he had performed 100,000 times. The weight of the weapon was familiar, comforting. A red light blinked on the console beside him, a priority Zeta astropathic communique forwarded from the surface. He accessed the message without interest. It was a single word, followed by coordinates. He sighed. It was always a sigh, a quiet exhalation of profound boredom. He had hoped they could conclude the Tithe collection in this system and move on. Strays were always an administrative headache. He toggled his internal vox. Shuttle bay. Prep the suppression squad. We have a stray. Standard containment protocol. I want it bagged and on board within the hour. He went back to polishing his maul. For the girl below, the world was ending. For Kalin, the schedule had just become slightly inconvenient. The shuttle descended not with the brute force of the larger vessel, but with a terrifying, predatory silence. Its black hull absorbed the twilight, its engines emitting only a low, hungry hum. From its ramp emerged not men in grey, but figures clad head to toe in the sable armor of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica's suppression squads. Their helmets were featureless, their weapons bulky and unfamiliar. They moved with a liquid grace that was utterly inhuman, their presence radiating a coldness that had nothing to do with the temperature. As they advanced, the very air around Ilara grew heavy, the familiar psychic whispers of her world fading into a muted buzz, then into nothing. It was the crushing silence of the null field, and it was the most terrifying thing she had ever felt. Her tribe, her family, who had stood frozen in fear of the grey-clad men, now took a collective step back from her. Their faces were a mixture of terror and a grim, undeniable relief. In their eyes, she was no longer the child they had known. She was the source of this new horror, a magnet for the wrath of the dark sky gods. It was a silent, communal act of sacrifice, an offering to make the monsters go away. Ilara stood alone, a child of 13 winters, abandoned by everyone she had ever known. She did not even try to run. Where could she run to when the entire world had cast her out? From Kalin's perspective, the capture was flawless. He watched on his helmet's picked feed from the shuttle's cockpit. The target was isolated. The locals were compliant. The suppression squad moved in, their null auras scrambling the target's witch sight before she could even think to use it. They did not speak to her. They did not touch her with their bare hands. One trooper fired a suppression net, enveloping her in a tangle of crackling energy that sent her spasming to the ground. Another clamped a heavy, psycho-dampening hood over her head, plunging her into total darkness and silence. Manacles were locked onto her wrists and ankles. Standard procedure. Efficient. Clean. He made a note in the log. Tithe designates 774 Delta secured. No complications. He felt a familiar, dull ache of impatience. Now came the long trip back to the Vigil. The interior of the black ship was a universe of its own. When the hood was finally pulled from Ilara's head, the sight that greeted her was a vision from the deepest hells of her tribe's darkest legends. She stood on a gantry overlooking a chasm so vast, so deep, that it seemed to have no bottom. And lining the walls of this chasm, stacked one on top of the other as far as the eye could see, were cages. Thousands upon thousands of them, each holding a handful of shivering, hollow-eyed souls. A low, constant murmur of weeping, praying, and mad whispers filled the immense space, a sound that was immediately swallowed by the oppressive psychic silence. She was stripped of her furs and tribal beads, her skin scrubbed raw by an auto-cleaner, and she was given a single, rough-spun synth-cloth tunic. An adept with a hot branding iron pressed a mark onto the back of her neck. Her name was gone. Her life was gone. She was now just a number. Cargo. Kalin watched the new batch being processed. He stood on a higher gantry, shock maul resting on his shoulder, his eyes scanning the crowd for any sign of trouble. The girl from the forest, 774 Delta, was small, even for her age. She stood trembling, her eyes wide with a catatonic horror that he had seen many times before. It was a look that usually preceded a total mental collapse. As she was shoved towards her designated cell, her eyes met his for a fraction of a second. He saw not fear, not hatred, but a pleading, bottomless confusion. A question: why? For the briefest of moments, a flicker of something ancient and unfamiliar stirred within him, a ghost of a feeling he had thought long dead. He crushed it instantly. It was a dangerous, useless emotion. He turned his gaze away, focusing on the next cage. There was no why. There was only the tithe. Time ceased to have meaning aboard the silent vigil. There was no day, no night, only the monotonous cycle of the lumen globes brightening to a harsh, sterile gray and dimming to a near-total blackness. Elara, the child from the twilight forest, grew into a young woman in this cage of iron and silence. The years were marked not by seasons or festivals, but by the faces that came and went in the surrounding cages, some taken away for testing, others simply expiring from despair, their bodies removed with cold efficiency by servitors. She learned to live with the gnawing hunger in her soul, the void left by the null field that felt like a phantom limb, constantly aching for a connection that was no longer there. The constant psychic starvation dulled her mind, leached the color from her memories, and left a permanent hollow echo in her heart. She witnessed the slow, inevitable decay of the human mind under such pressure. A man in a nearby cage spent his cycles endlessly scratching equations onto the floor with a sliver of bone, his eyes lost in some frantic internal calculus, until the day he simply stopped moving. A young girl, captured not much older than Elara had been, would sometimes scream for days on end, a raw, animalistic sound of pure terror, until an armsman would approach her cage with a long shock maul, and then there would be silence. These events were the grim punctuation marks in an endless sentence of misery. They were warnings. They were prophecies of her own potential end. It was from the veterans, those who had endured the journey for decades, whose minds had been hardened into a strange, brittle cynicism, that she learned the truth of their destination. In hushed, frantic whispers during the dim cycles, they spoke of holy Terra. They spoke of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica and the great psychic choirs. One old man, his face a roadmap of scars, spoke of the soul binding, a ritual that forged a psyker's mind to the Emperor's will, a process that incinerated 1 in 10 who undertook it. Another woman, whose eyes held a terrifying emptiness, whispered of the Astronomicon, the great beacon, and how its choir of 10,000 souls were burned out like living candles, their minds consumed by the sheer power they were forced to channel. But they all spoke with the greatest dread of the final, ultimate tithe, the 1,000 a day, the fuel for the throne. They didn't know the specifics, only that it was an end without honor, without remembrance, without even a grave. It was simply an ending. From his watch station, Kalin observed the cargo. Over the centuries, he had developed an eye for the stages of decay. The initial terror, the subsequent catatonia, the slow slide into either hopeless apathy or violent madness. He had put down hundreds of thrashers over the years, his shock maul delivering a quiet, efficient end to their misery. He felt nothing doing it. It was like culling a sick animal from a herd. One cycle, a boy in the lower tiers, no older than 12, lost control. For a single terrifying second, the null field flickered. Reality warped. The metal of the cages around the boy softened and began to drip like wax. Kalin felt a lance of pure, psychic cold jab at his mind. Then, the field reasserted itself with a sharp hum, and the suppression squad was there, their weapons firing streams of white-hot energy. The incident was over in less than a minute. Kalin logged it as minor containment breach. Level Gamma threat neutralized. 3 biological units expired as collateral damage. He requested an extra ration of Amasec from the quartermaster. It was going to be a long century. Attention. All hands, attention. Entering Segmentum Solar. Final approach to Terra initiated. The Emperor awaits his due. Terra was not a world. It was a scar of civilization so vast it had consumed a planet. Through a grimy viewport, Ilara caught her first and only glimpse of the throne world. There was no blue, no green, no oceans, no clouds. Only an endless, unbroken expanse of grey and gold metal. A global city that stabbed at the void with 1 billion spires. It was a tomb world, a monument of such overwhelming scale that it seemed to suck the very light from its star. As the silent vigil docked and its null fields were finally mercifully lowered, Ilara's psychic senses, starved for decades, were suddenly slammed by a tidal wave of unimaginable force. It was the psychic scream of Terra itself, the aggregated consciousness of trillions of souls, a constant, deafening roar of prayer, devotion, ambition, fear, and pain. The sensory shock was so violent it threw her to her knees, blood trickling from her nose as her mind struggled to process the sheer psychic weight of 1 billion lives. Deep beneath the planet's gilded crust, in the cold, sanctified silence of the Imperial Palace's sublevels, Magos Auxiliary 7 Xylos performed his endless vigil. His designation was Caretaker of the 16th Ossuary Circuit, a title whose significance was known only to a handful of other magi. His world was sublevel Gamma 7, a sterile, cavernous chamber where the air smelled of ozone and sacred machine oils. Here, there was no gold, only the cold, functional grey of adamantium bulkheads and the soft green glow of humming cogitator screens. The only music was the deep, resonant thrum of the Golden Throne's auxiliary power conduits and the rhythmic clicking of data relays, a symphony that 7 Xylos knew as the Litany of Dissolution. He was more machine than man, his remaining organic components housed within a gleaming chassis of brass and steel. Flesh, to 7 Xylos, was the ultimate heresy, a chaotic, inefficient, and decaying medium. The machine was pure, logical, eternal. His faith was not in a distant, unseen god, but in the Omnissiah, the machine god, whose greatest sacrament was the conversion of the imperfect into the perfect, the chaotic into the orderly. And the process he oversaw was the holiest of these sacraments, the rendering of flawed biological psyche units into pure, quantifiable soul energy. It was not an act of cruelty, it was an act of purification, a sacred, logical function. His duties were a precise, unchanging ritual. He did not merely watch screens, he communed with the machine spirit of the circuit. His mechadendrites would link into the primary conduits, his mind merging with the flow of data. He would chant the binary litanies of maintenance, his voice a synthesized monotone, as he monitored the energy transfer from the 1,000 daily biofuel cells to the throne's arcane capacitors. He ensured the soul-scourging process was optimized, that every joule of spiritual energy was harvested with minimal waste before the biological component expired. His greatest satisfaction came from a clean, efficient transfer, a perfect 99.9% energy capture ratio. Sometimes, however, his logic was disturbed. A flicker in the data, a ghost reading that defied the clean mathematics of the process. A momentary spike on the anguish decibel reader that his processors could not pass. He had logged thousands of these anomalies over the centuries, classifying them as unforeseen biological feedback. To consider them as the echo of a consciousness being annihilated would be illogical, and logic was his only god. A notification scrolled across his primary display. ++, incoming tithe shipment Astropathicus, vessel, silent vigil, batch designation, 881 lambda, ready for processing. ++7 Xylos' optical sensors scanned the list of designations, 10,000 new fuel cells. He accessed the first 1,000 profiles, noting their psychic grades. Most were low gamma, standard fuel. His attention briefly paused on one, Tithe designates 774 delta, moderate gamma potential, unremarkable. He initiated the transfer protocols, sending a binary canticle of acknowledgement to the orbital docks. The great machine was hungry, and its next meal was ready. The final transfer was an exercise in cold, Imperial logistics. Armsman Kalin stood at the primary disembarkation portal, his shock maul held in a parade rest across his chest. His duty was almost complete. He watched as the first 1,000 souls from Batch 881 Lambda were herded out of the Silent Vigil's hold and onto the docking arm of the Eternal Citadel, a high-orbit station that served as the primary processing hub for the psychic tithe. The air on the station was thick with the scent of ozone and recycled incense. Standing in silent, golden-armored judgment were 2 custodians, their guardian spears held perfectly still, their very presence a suffocating wave of authority and ancient purpose. They did not watch the psychers. Their gaze was fixed on some distant, unseen horizon. They were not here as guards, but as witnesses to a sacred transaction. A robed Logi priest of the Administratum approached Kalin, his face a pale, passionless mask. He held out a data slate. Kalin slotted his own slate into the offered device. A stream of data transferred with a soft chime. The tithe was now officially delivered. The 10,000 souls, including the girl from the forest, were no longer his responsibility. They now belonged to the machine of Terra. Kalin gave a curt, formal nod, turned his back on the weeping, shuffling line of prisoners, and walked back into the familiar, psychic silence of his ship. He did not look back. There was nothing to see but another completed delivery. In his mind, he was already calculating the resupply manifests for the next voyage. The great hunt for souls was never-ending. For Elara, the sensory assault was absolute. Freed from the null field, the psychic roar of 1,000,000,000,000 minds was a constant, deafening scream in her head. The journey from the orbital station down to the planet's surface was a descent into the very heart of the Imperial machine. They were loaded onto immense, grav-powered elevators, cage-like contraptions that plunged them deep into the planet's crust, past levels of unimaginable complexity. Through the armored glass, she saw cities within cities, great chasms lit by artificial suns, and rivers of machinery that flowed like molten metal. It was a sight of such terrible, inhuman grandeur that her mind could not process it. It was the work of gods, or devils. They were not led through the hallowed halls that pilgrims dream of. There were no golden statues or soaring archways. Their path was through stark, utilitarian corridors stamped with numerals and sector designations, lit by a cold, unforgiving light. The air grew colder, and the psychic pressure intensified with every level they descended. It coalesced around a single, dominant presence, a mind of such colossal power that it felt like a star, its gravity pulling her own small consciousness into its orbit. The other prisoners were a gallery of broken humanity. Some chanted litanies in cracked, hoarse voices. Others wept silently. Many, like Elara, simply walked, their eyes vacant, their bodies moving on pure, terrified instinct. Hope had been surgically excised from them long ago. All that remained was the grim, animalistic knowledge of the approaching end. The procession finally halted before a set of colossal adamantium gates, each one the size of a starship's bridge. They were sealed, yet from beyond them, Elara could feel it. The source of the pressure, the mind of the star. A power so immense, so ancient, so full of unending agony. The Emperor was waiting. The adamantium gates did not open with a sound. They receded into the walls with a silent, inexorable weight, revealing the chamber beyond, the Hall of the Thousand. The air that washed over them was not merely cold, it was a dead, ancient cold that seemed to cling to the soul. It smelled of ozone, of superchilled metal, and something else, a faint coppery tang that spoke of millennia of organic processes and psychic residue. A deep, subsonic hum vibrated through the floor, a sound felt not in the ears, but in the very marrow of their bones. Elara and the other 999 souls were herded inside, their shuffling footsteps the only small, human sound in a space built for gods and monsters. And then she saw it clearly. The golden throne, it was not a chair. It was a mountain of brass, gold, and unknowable archaeotech. A vast, baroque engine of torment and salvation that soared into the darkness of the vaulted ceiling above. Cables as thick as a man's torso snaked from its base, pulsing with a sickly, golden light, connecting it to humming capacitor banks that lined the chamber walls. It was a cathedral of machinery, a life support system, a psychic amplifier, and a tomb, all fused into one impossible, terrifying whole. And enthroned at its heart, she saw him. The master of mankind, the corpse god. A skeletal figure, so withered and ancient it seemed ready to crumble to dust, was held together by a web of shimmering tubes and wires. His face was a skull, his eye sockets black, empty voids. Yet, from this dead thing, this relic of a man, erupted a psychic presence so overwhelming it was a physical force, a supernova of pure will that bent reality around it. The sheer, impossible paradox of a dead god radiating such life was the final blow to Ilara's sanity. Her mind, already frayed by years of torment, simply fractured. From his console, 7 Xylos observed the new batch with cold satisfaction. The biological components had entered the sanctum. Their vital signs, displayed on his screen, showed extreme stress. Cardiac rhythms, erratic, neuroactivity, chaotic. He logged it as standard, pre-processing biological anxiety, an expected and ultimately irrelevant variable. The litany of connection began. With a series of binary commands, he activated the chamber's servitors. From hidden alcoves in the walls, silent, multi-limbed machines emerged. They moved with the silent, pre-programmed grace of the Omnissiah's will. Their cold, metallic claws gently but firmly guided each of the 1,000 psychers onto a designated circular dais etched into the floor, arranging them in a complex, concentric pattern around the throne. It was a beautiful, precise, mechanical ballet. 7 Xylos watched the data feed as each component was secured. He was now a part of the machine, his consciousness linked to the chamber's systems. He felt the servitors' touch, saw through their optical sensors, and registered the compliance of the flesh. His own flesh, what little remained of it, felt nothing. His mind was a cool, calm ocean of logic. He initiated the final preparatory sequence. From the ceiling, 1,000 articulated arms descended, each ending in a complex headpiece of wires, needles, and psychic conductors. The crowns of thorns, the interface between the transient flesh and the eternal machine. Ilara felt a cold, metallic hand guide her onto a circle on the floor. She did not resist. She looked at the faces of the others around her. A young boy, his face a mask of white terror, was silently weeping. An old man was chanting, his eyes screwed shut in frantic prayer. Most, however, were like her, their faces blank, their eyes wide with a horror too deep for expression. She looked back at the skeletal god on his mountain of gold. The psychic pressure was no longer just a presence, it was a voice, 1,000 warring voices in her head. She could feel his unending battle, see flashes of the demonic legions he held at bay in the warp. She felt a sliver of his 10,000-year agony. Then, she looked up. A crown of cold, sharp wires was descending directly towards her. The moment the first needle-like contact touched her skin, her universe dissolved into a silent, searing, white-hot fire. The white fire was not hot. It was a cold, absolute, and silent conflagration that consumed thought itself. It was the sensation of the machine's will crashing into Ilara's mind, a data tsunami that scoured her clean. Her connection to the physical world was the first thing to be severed. The sight of the corpse god on his throne, the monumental scale of the chamber, the cold of the dais beneath her feet, it all fractured into a blizzard of meaningless sensory data, a storm of static where reality had once been. Her body was convulsing, her heart hammering against her ribs, but her body was already a distant, irrelevant concept. She was a consciousness trapped in a dissolving vessel, watching the walls of her own mind being torn down. Then, the machine began to feed. It did not take her life. It took her life story. Her memories, the very threads that composed the tapestry of her existence, were pulled loose one by one. She felt the twilight forest of Oakhaven being ripped from her, the memory of the phosphorescent moss and the scent of damp earth turning to ash. The memory of her brother Kale's laughter as they chased scuttlers was extracted with a searing pain, leaving a bleeding hollow void where familial love had once resided. Her mother's face, the lullabies she sang in the dim light of the hollowed tree, the taste of her first ripe glowberry, each memory, each precious defining moment was located, isolated, and consumed by the throne's insatiable hunger. It was an act of profound violation, an erasure that was worse than death. It was the death of experience itself. From his sanctified console, Seven Xylos observed the process with the detached reverence of a priest watching a sacrament unfold. On his primary screen, 1,000 scrolling data streams displayed the deconstruction. ++, memory engram excision, 100% complete. ++++, personality matrix unspooling, in progress. ++++, soul energy yield projection, optimal. ++, he chanted a low, binary litany of praise. Praise be to the Omnisire, who renders the chaotic flesh into the pure motive force. Praise be to the holy machine, that turns the weakness of biology into the strength of the eternal circuit. The screams that echoed in the chamber were not registered by his audio sensors. To him, it was merely the sound of inefficient biological components releasing waste, heat, and pressure. It was meaningless noise, interrupting the clean, perfect hum of the machine. As the last of her personal memories were stripped away, Ilara's sense of I began to fray and unravel. Her personality, her hopes, her deep-seated fear of the dark, her quiet curiosity, her capacity for love and anger, all were deconstructed into their base components and rendered down into raw, psychic energy. And in this state of dissolution, as she ceased to be a singular entity, her psychic senses flared one last, brilliant, and horrifying time. She was no longer just Ilara. She became a part of a greater, terrible whole. She felt the other 999 souls being consumed alongside her, their fading consciousnesses brushing against her own like dying embers in a gale. And she felt the others, the billions, the psychic scar tissue of 10 millennia of sacrifice, a permanent wound in the fabric of reality within this chamber. It was a single, continuous, silent scream of pure agony, the collective death rattle of a trillion sacrificed souls. She was drowning in an ocean of the dead, but there was something else within that ocean, a presence, a mind so vast it was a universe unto itself. It was not the benevolent, guiding light of the Imperial creed. It was a shattered continent of consciousness, a mind locked in a constant, multi-front war, its thoughts a raging battlefield. It was a fortress under siege from every conceivable angle, holding back an ocean of unimaginable psychic filth. It was ancient, it was powerful, and it was in unending, absolute agony. It was the Emperor. Within the raging, godlike mind of the Emperor, Ilara's dissolving consciousness saw the truth of the Imperium in a single, terrible, and eternal moment. She saw a vast, golden bulwark of sheer will holding back an ocean of madness and hate. She witnessed the endless siege, a war fought not with guns and blades, but with thought and symbol on a psychic plane where a single moment of weakness could mean the damnation of a billion worlds. She saw the leering, fractal faces of the dark gods, their whispers like poison, their promises like cancerous growths on the fabric of reality. She saw legions of demons, their forms clawing at the psychic barrier of Terra, their hunger for mankind a palpable, living thing. She saw the great game of chaos in all its horrifying complexity, and she felt the Emperor's response, an act of defiance sustained for 10 millennia, a will so potent and so utterly focused that it had burned away all traces of the man he once was, leaving only the cold, hard diamond of purpose. His agony was the fire of a billion suns, a pain that would have annihilated any lesser being, yet he endured. He had to endure. In that final nanosecond, her fading existence was not just consumed, it was weaponized. Her life force, her soul, her pain, It was all stripped down and hurled like a single grain of sand against the infinite tide of chaos, a tiny reinforcement to the golden wall. And with this came the final, horrifying understanding. It was not a choice. It was not a glorious sacrifice. It was a law of cosmic physics. Her agony was a necessary component. Her complete and utter annihilation was required for the continued existence of a species that would never know her name, that would, in fact, hunt and hate others just like her. Her final thought was not of her home, nor her family, for those memories were long gone. It was a single, piercing moment of terrible, absolute clarity. And then, the fire went out. She was gone. On the console in sub-level Gamma 7, the data stream for Tithe Designate 774 Delta flatlined. The energy transfer was complete. But at the exact moment of cessation, the anomaly occurred. A massive, illogical spike on the anguish decibel reader, an impossible reading that screamed off the chart for a fraction of a second. Simultaneously, a cascade of corrupted data flooded the short-range pict recorder on the servitor skull monitoring the dais. Seven Xylos's augmetic mind worked furiously to pass the error. He isolated the data fragment and displayed it on his secondary screen. It was a single, corrupted image. The face of the biological component, 774 Delta. The pict feed was distorted, washed out by psychic energy. But the face was clear. The scream was gone. The terror was gone. What remained was an expression that Seven Xylos's logic engines could not categorize. It was not peace. It was not acceptance. It was an expression of profound, impossible, and terrifying comprehension. The look of a being who had just gazed upon the fundamental architecture of the universe and seen that it was built of nothing but pain. Finding no logical classification for such an expression, Seven Xylos designated the image as data corruption via extreme psychic detonation. He appended a note: recommend recalibration of pict recorder's emotional spectrum filters. Then, following Protocol 9 Gamma for handling unclassifiable data, he sealed the fragment in a digital archive, encrypted it with the highest authority codes, and buried it in a data vault that would not be opened for another millennium. The ghost was contained. The machine was pure. Far out in the cold darkness of the segmentum solar, the silent vigil turned its bow towards the distant stars. On its bridge, Armsman Kalin approved the new flight path. Another system, another tithe, another shipment of cargo to be collected. His role in the fate of the girl from the forest was over, and already forgotten. His is the truth of the Imperium's vast, unthinking cruelty, the truth of the Ferryman, whose soul has been calloused over by centuries of dutifully transporting the damned, a cog in a machine whose function he no longer questions. In the depths of the Imperial Palace, Magos Auxiliary 7 Xylos began the litany of connection for the next batch of 1,000 souls. His is the truth of the Imperium's cold logic, the truth of the Caretaker, who sees not human life, but biological components to be rendered down for the glory of the machine. His humanity sacrificed for a faith in cold, hard data. And the girl named Elara, her truth is the bedrock upon which it is all built. The truth of the tithed, that a soul can be born, can live, can love, and can be utterly and completely erased, its only purpose to serve as a single silent scream in the unending defense against the dark. Today, we chronicled the souls that fuel the Emperor's life. But what of the souls that fuel his war machine, not through psychic power, but through the cold, hard logic of steel and circuitry? The Imperium's survival rests on two pillars: the psychic might of the Emperor and the technological supremacy of the Adeptus Mechanicus. In our next transmission, we will unseal the service logs of Ascitari Maniples from the Metallica Forge world and reveal the horrifying, fleshly cost of loyalty to the machine god. To ensure these stories are not lost to the void, subscribe and activate the notifier bell. You must be present when the next seal is broken.